Welcome to Studying Law Around the World. I'm Claudio Klaus. In each episode, I talk with lawyers, law students, and professors from different parts of the world to talk about legal education, careers, and what the profession looks like in real life. We talk about the hard parts, the surprises, and the decisions that shaped their paths. Whether you're planning to study abroad, thinking about working in another legal system, or just curious about how law works around the world, this podcast is for you. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Studying Law Around the World. Today, I have the opportunity to host Saad Minhas. He is a Canadian in-house lawyer working at the intersection of real estate, infrastructure, energy, and technology. He's had roles in different companies all across North America and also has been an active member of the legal profession with mentorship initiatives and many others. I'm very, very excited to be chatting with him today. Thank you so much for making the time to come to the podcast.
Hi, Claudia. Thank you so much for having me.
And to start off, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners and walk us through a little bit about your journey.
Oh, thank you. So I would say infrastructure has been a through line in my career from the beginning. I started out as a consultant on large public-private partnerships, working on major infrastructure such as hospitals, highways, transit, and the like. And so it made sense for me when I began my articles that I would continue in that vein. And so I've had the opportunity to essentially be able to weave the various elements of infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I mean broadly real estate, construction, and power. And so elements of that in each case, whether it was in government, then with a major bank, and then with a real estate startup, and following that, and for the past 6-ish years in data centers, working with some of the leading companies, essentially developing data centers.
Amazing. So working from across these major organizations, including global banks, infrastructure agencies, including also companies focused on AI powered data centers. What have been, maybe a turning point that has shaped your career so far?
I think that early on in my career, my mentors have always kind of emphasized number one, being solution oriented and looking at the problems that I am best equipped to address, being curious throughout that process. And so the turning points that shaped my career were really about opportunities for growth and where I could be of use. And so although there are plenty of real estate and construction lawyers who have worked for real estate developers or law firms specializing in those areas, I have kind of always drawn myself to unconventional ways of doing that. And so for that reason, I think that ultimately trusting that I can be of value to an organization, add value there, and that has always kind of taken me towards these turning points. And some of them were, I think, by my own choosing. Others, for example, when my term in government was up and they were having contract rules, I was then prompted to find something else. WeWork, where I was at for a little while, had its, well documented ups and downs. And so I found myself at the end of that journey, and that's perfectly fine. I think that ultimately, whether you are choosing when your time ends or whether that time is chosen for you, you still have decisions to make in terms of where you go next and how you take the experience that you've built and redirect that towards new opportunities.
Fantastic. I appreciate you bringing up the idea of, mentors and the role they played in your career so far. I've heard different things already. On one point, talking about the opportunities you could come to find if you will try to keep up your practice. As I had the opportunity to chat with quite a few practitioners who did find in a way a niche in law that they were able to really specialize on and really get an interesting career out of it, really focusing on their area. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. What are some things that you'd think, or maybe that you would even tell your younger self in the first few years of your practice, keeping it general?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and honestly one that I asked myself at different stages, and others have asked me. I've certainly asked my mentors. The term that is commonly used is like T-shaped lawyers, and so meaning that you have a certain degree of expertise, but still a versatility towards different and other, sometimes often parallel, but sometimes not even parallel areas of law that you stretch yourself out on and still try to advise on. I think that that is integral in today's marketplace. The reality is that we are now being challenged to do more with less, sometimes leverage resources such as AI, but not necessarily limited to AI, but really around commercial decision making that require you to have an in-depth understanding of the area where in fact you have the most expertise. And then in addition to that, really push yourself and drive yourself to stretch that capability into areas that you aren't familiar with, such that when you are dealing with novel issues, you are able to tackle those, or areas where there are others that are specialists that you are able to tackle those as well. Because the reality is that, now it seems that we have far more resources at our fingertips in order to be able to tap into, deep research or expertise. But that was always the case. Times you simply have to look at a new issue, thematically review it, and provide your best advice. And obviously, we have professional responsibility to leverage experts in the field when that is appropriate, and you absolutely should, because those people are experts for a reason. But it's not to say that you should not challenge yourself to really follow through on what it is they are doing, learn from them, and then be able to apply that knowledge in other ways. So, to answer your question in a very, very long manner, it's both and. You nowadays, I believe, have to be an expert as well as a generalist.
And when it comes to specific areas of law, when somebody tells me that they practice real estate law, I'm imagining automatically, somebody who's doing conveyances, who's doing, just residential work, some commercial real estate, maybe leasing, maybe or construction lean work. It seems like your career and the work you've done shows quite a bit of a different side of the practice. So I'd like to hear a little more, about your role as a real estate lawyer in different phases of your career, but really working, with technology, with large scale projects, with, global infrastructures. So can you tell us a little bit more about what, that practice can look like?
Yeah, I mean, I've always just been curious about unorthodox ways of practicing law, and so much as I respect and appreciate, practicing a law firm, spending a long time in that environment was really not something that I was as interested in the beginning phases of my career, and the modality that I wanted to see was really looking at places that I could bring my expertise and also challenge myself to learn more and push myself to be able to advise in spaces where they, would not, people wouldn't necessarily realize that you would have, for example, a real estate lawyer or a construction lawyer or an energy lawyer. And so for that reason, being able to be in places like banks and advising there was always interesting to me because I was able to kind of test out my capability in ways that I think I would not necessarily have had the level of exposure to had I been in a specialist shop. And similarly within data centers, I think this was like particularly interesting because in a manner that you have within a law firm and sometimes in-house teams as well, you're often streamed into a particular practice area. I, of course, mastered the task that I was given and the responsibility that I had within a particular area when I felt comfortable and my stakeholders felt comfortable that they were being supported. I continued to branch out into areas that were adjacent to that. And so, sometimes we look at a causal nexus. You have that between areas of law and practice areas as well. So I do think that there's a through line and a connectivity between areas like real estate and procurement and construction and energy, particularly on major infrastructure projects when these are all components, including things like financing and commercial agreements and tax, et cetera, but really knowing and understanding really cradle to grave of the deal. And my thought process on this was never just about the legal practice. Is yes, of course, I have to be able to master that and provide the best advice to my clients, my stakeholders. But I think even beyond that, when I considered this as a recipient of that advice as a consultant, I would always think to myself, I want that solution. I don't really care how it's delivered, but I think the greater consistency I have within that and being able to carry that file from start to finish is incredibly valuable because it creates a level of accountability and familiarity that is particularly helpful because these projects are not always separated out phase by phase. You may have different contractors come in on a project phase by phase, but that handover and that a consistency across a project can be incredibly valuable in order to deliver that asset.
I'm curious here, as you spoke about that intersection of real estate, energy, infrastructure, and so forth. I know that one of the interesting points was, how are they related? How do we see all of this coming together in the practice? And I really appreciate you mentioning both the idea of the T-shaped lawyer and also the idea of being commercially a good advisor, not only in the law, but really helping out in the business, as you were really an important part of the business when you're acting in house. So tell me more about that. How are those connected? And maybe how should lawyers or law students who are just, kind of coming into the market this shift?
With AI, there's been a lot of discussion about how we use AI and AI tools. And I think that that's important and it's critical. What there is significantly less discussion about, although you will read a lot more about it in, the trade press, the financial press, is around the business of AI and uh, AI infrastructure. Essentially, if we are comparing it to, driving your car to work and how integral that is to your day, let's also consider the automobile makers and the people that built the highway and essentially the infrastructure that allows all of this to actually occur. And that to me is very interesting and very exciting. I think because the level of time sensitivity on these transactions is unlike anything I have seen before. When they talk about the AI race, it is truly treated like a race. And so you need to be able to provide advice and really commercially oriented advice in a very, very short period of time and ensure that, in fact, your advice is sufficient to carry that asset and that project throughout the life cycle. Because when you look at a data center as the thing that essentially enables AI to function the way that it does, that data center is typically intended to function for at least a period of 10 to 15 years. So a decision that you make within a period of a week, or if you're lucky, a month, needs to be able to carry forward for years and years to come and the life cycle of that asset, and sometimes the evolution of how that asset is utilized. So, to touch on another question that you asked around being business savvy and business oriented, it's really important to learn about, I think, the components of how your clients think about an issue. And when it comes, in my example, to data centers, really looking at what drives the business. What is the profit incentive for these projects? What does success look like? How are you serving the customer? These are all questions that you should be asking before you are undertaking your particular area of advice that you are providing. That is critical to success because it's your North Star. It should guide and dictate every decision. And in fact, it should help you analyze risk as well, because you are, of course, ideally an enabler of success, but at the same time, you need to understand that sometimes there is risk in those outcomes. And how do you identify in that pathway to providing that advice where the risk can arise, and perhaps other channels in which you can achieve the same outcome, but perhaps with lesser risk?
I don't think that everybody has the privilege of having a career as diverse as yours. While navigating through the same specialty area, I see that you've moved between public sector, private sector, in-house. What are some of the differences that you noticed in your career as you went through these different spots? How legal work happens across these environments, and maybe even our audience here, our students, they are early career professionals.
I'm so glad you asked me this. I'm a firm believer that the space that you work in does not define you, nor does it define your career. I think that there are stars in every organization or form of practice. And the way to be a star in that is to really look at the task in front of you and not necessarily being dictated by the perception of your environment. That sounds like super fluffy, so I'm going to be a bit more specific about it. Look, like some of the truisms or ideas about how government can sometimes be bureaucratic, or banks can be very risk averse and slow to make decisions, or startups can move very quickly, or data, large tech companies can, sometimes be not considering end users or the public in the same way that, government, for example, has a responsibility to the taxpayer. Look, some of these things, you might see echoes of these within organizations, but the reality is that you will always have people within these organizations, and people as individuals and sometimes as collectives as well are thoughtful, far more thoughtful than sometimes we, in a blanket manner, give them credit to being. The level of deliberation I saw in government, and thoughtfulness about how this impacts end users and communities, and in banks about considering, people who, their lives rely on the services of a bank, or, within large technology companies on how they can, support communities to grow. It's far more than, sometimes the kind of ideas of these types of organizations will give them credit for. But taking it back to, people's approaches and how they navigate their career in these spaces. Look, if you want to be in one particular area or one particular modality of work for the entirety of your career, power to you. That's fantastic. You are able to deploy your skill set in a space that you like and you can grow in that. And that's incredible. And if you do like a level of versatility in terms of, where you work and apply your skill set, then actually you can do that too. And you can do it again and again and again in your career if you so choose. And I don't think that it necessarily has to be limiting. I think that the only limitation that you would have is your own ability to demonstrate that you were of value within that organization, and you can communicate it effectively when you have the opportunity to do so, because there are parallels across a whole host of sectors, and as long as you're able to demonstrate how that exists, that you are well positioned to be able to make moves as you please.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing it. I think that's so important. We're a lot of people who are kind of led by their curiosity throughout their career. As opportunities arise, they were able to take different directions. Narrative that you're building for yourself and for your career. You've been involved in quite a few complex negotiation ventures, really high stake projects. When I think about, what kind of skills do you use in those situations? Law school gets a little bit of a bad reputation for not preparing people really for the world of work. I'm curious, are there, a few sets of skills that you thought that have mattered the most, specifically in these kinds of high stakes situations that really helped you to navigate through them?
Yes, absolutely. I would say from pretty early on, I'd read something somewhere about the type of learner you are. You know, whether you are an auditory learner or you learn through, visuals or through reading, etc. I don't think it necessarily needs to be definitive. I think we learn in a multitude of ways. But I do think that it can help having some thought towards that, because particularly when you're dealing with complex subject matter, it really helps to be able to have that, ingested in a way that is preferable to you, because it can seem very daunting at the outset, but when you play it out in your head in the way that suits you, you can find ways to simplify it a little bit. And, as a practical reference, sometimes I will, write things down, draw things out, record them and listen back to them. And it seems, silly almost, but I think, particularly when you're dealing with something complex and you want to make sure that you understand it, look, first off, it never hurts to ask questions, particularly when you're being thoughtful about it and you've already made a level of effort to understand the issues. Any questions that address the gaps and demonstrate that you have clearly attempted to learn this yourself are typically welcome. But even beyond that, I think being able to navigate and understanding complex issues in a way that is receptive to you is very helpful. I remember when I was in government, I had already been working on large JV projects as a consultant for many years. So I walked in thinking like, okay, I should understand this. This should be, fairly familiar. And when I started working on it, I don't know what it is. I think a law degree comes with a very high degree of self-doubt. So I began to question whether I knew what I actually knew. And I just had to, take a moment, take a deep breath, pause, draw out the structure of how the JV was set up on the project that I was working on and supporting, and that helped. That helped a lot because I was like, okay. this isn't so complex. And then I asked a couple of questions from my colleagues to make sure that, I really understood what in fact I thought I understood. And they were able to confirm it. Since then, that self-doubt will always be there. I think that anytime you feel like the stakes are high, you question your capability, with a bit of practice and, a little bit of time and thoughtfulness, I really don't think that there's any particular area of law that is truly rocket science. I mean, there are incredibly intelligent lawyers out there who you can also again use as resources to tap into, but at least have like a baseline understanding with some effort. I think most people are very capable.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing it. And I know you've been involved in quite a few different projects. You've been involved in pro bono work, in access to justice initiatives, in a lot of mentorship as well. So I'm curious, how do you think that lawyers can stay connected to that side of the profession?
So I have to give credit where it's due. I got that from my parents. I've been a lifelong volunteer because I've always been taught that that's a responsibility that I have, and I found it incredibly enriching and rewarding to be able to give back in every which way I possibly can. I think that the level of effort that it takes for an individual to do that pays off dramatically more for the recipient of that assistance. And so for me, it's the best investment you can possibly make of your time. And whether it's pro bono work, which by the way, I think has made me a better lawyer always. I think about some of the legal aid clinics I've worked with and supported, being able to provide pro bono advice to people that I know or have come to me. You have to be responsible in doing so. You have to be very thoughtful. But that I think sometimes increased standard of care is it really improves your capability. And so I recommend it to anyone. Like, I mean, access to justice is a huge challenge. Um, and, whether you are doing things in your community or at a global level, we are all citizens and we have the gift of advocacy as lawyers. And that's something that I think that we should take forward any way that we are able to do. I think that that's a responsibility that we all have. And as far as mentorship is concerned, I've been very fortunate to have incredible mentors. I'm simply passing along a lot of the great advice that I've received, and I welcome having those conversations at any opportunity.
Is there a piece of advice that you'd like to give to someone trying to build, a global future-oriented legal career?
So many different great pieces of advice that I received over time, but the one I always come back to is the one from my parents around is that values translate. No matter where you go, values translate. I think that sometimes feel conscious about how they fit in, and depending on the context you're in and the people that you're around, that can certainly feel daunting and sometimes rightfully so. But I will say that being kind, being decent, staying true to your values, irrespective of whether those are necessarily reflected back at you, I think has always paid off. I think that ultimately, um, decency, it really does overwhelm other things. And I think that that also means sometimes decency and respect and these types of values that are often shared values. They also dictate you professionally because if somebody gives you a task, you have the values and understanding and the respect to put hard work into that and deliver and turn that around. Um, and be clear in your communications to the extent that you're able. I think that that's always been a guiding light for me, and I think that it's something that I hope people can kind of take forward as relatable to them, irrespective of where those values derive from.
Fantastic. I just wanted to thank you once again for making the time to come on the show. And thank you all for tuning into today's episode and listening to this episode.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.